Hey, it's me, Travis, your host. I'm doing my own pitch. How lame is that? So, anyway, yeah, if you listen to this podcast, thanks. But be forewarned, you could be unfriended, unfollowed, and uncompromising if you listen to Rethinking Revelation.
What are you kidding? We got some awesome podcasts here.
Welcome back to another exciting adventure of Rethinking Revelation. I'm your host, Travis Finley. This is episode 88, and in this episode we have the exciting discussion on hell. I have a Facebook acquaintance. I guess we could be friends, We're friends, right? Facebook friends? Are we friends, David? I think so. David King, and we bumped into each other by knowing the same kind of people. You know how that goes, and then we get to be friends. So David has started a Facebook group called Pioneering Spirits, Breakthrough and Revelation, Preterism, Inclusionism. This is what he says about the group. The purpose of the group is to facilitate a spiritual research community that would be a safe place, amen, for spiritual pioneers to come and find support, new topics, encouragement, revelation, breakthrough, and fellowship together as we seek to pursue deeper truths and an intimate relationship with our Abba God. And so David contacted me and said that he would like to try to throw out some questions and address some issues in Scripture where the doctrine of hell is allegedly derived from, and we talk about that. So he asked me some questions, and it was kind of shoot from the hip for me, but I didn't mind. I think that for me, I enjoy that kind of Q&A because that challenges me to delve into my understanding and grasp of the topic. And so I had a good time. We plan on doing a follow-up because it would just, this episode is going to be a two-parter because it was an hour and 45 minutes of content, and I think we only got through a third of the questions, so but it was good. It was good. So sit back, get your cup of joe, and enjoy the show.
Yeah, I was going to ask you how you wanted to do that. If you wanted to tackle phrases first.
I'll just follow your lead.
Do you want to hit the whole list, or do you want me to just?
We'll go through however much you want.
Okay. Let's just cruise through it and see what happens.
Yeah.
That'd
be good.
All right. So these are all big hell topics, like keywords, big events, and parables and phrases and stuff like that. And when you talk to people about hell, they'll be like, well, what about this? What about, all the elements will be destroyed with fire, and you'll be blotted out of the book of life, and Satan being thrown into the lake of fire, stuff like that. And you're like, we had these images painted. And so basically, I have all these questions spelled out to walk through those, all the controversial phrases.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll hit keywords last. So let's just start with the big ones. We'll start big and then come down. So we'll start with Lazarus and the rich man. The parable of Lazarus and the rich man.
You want me to just go off of that?
You want to start with that? Is that what you asked?
That's all you're giving me? No, I'm just.
Oh yeah.
No, that's fine. That's fine. So okay, yeah. So I'll just talk about that off the top of my head. One thing that comes to my mind again in all of this is what our presuppositions are, what our underlying paradigms are that we use to maneuver and navigate through the reading of Scripture. So the interesting thing about the parable is it's not called a parable as far as I know. It doesn't introduce itself as a parable. Luke 16 follows Luke 15, and in each of the three parables in Luke 15, they're called parables. But in Luke 16, it's not delineated that way, and so a lot of pushback that we might find is that someone will say, well, it doesn't say it's a parable. So then,
right.
What's the nature of the story? What do we know? What do we know before we get to the story? So if we think about the metaphysical reality of life after death and what we see in that story, there are certain things that exist in that story that we might not necessarily think about, and we might just, gloss over and just not even give it a second thought. But so if we think about the story in a literal fashion, the rich man says to Lazarus, "Dip your finger in the water and touch it to my tongue." Okay, so we have physical, corporeal, tangible aspects to the story. We've got a finger, we've got water, and we've got a tongue. And so if we think about the dynamics of that, my question is, how does the rich man and Lazarus, how do they have physical bodies?
Mm-hmm.
Because
it's supposed to be a spirit realm, yeah.
Right, it's a spirit realm. So then we have to fudge and go, well, that's a good question. So, well, maybe then it's this. And we're like, yeah, right now you're totally coloring outside the line because the text says nothing about that. It doesn't qualify anything, yada, 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 all that kind of stuff. But if we think about context and if we think about simply reading the Bible as we do under the guidelines of simply reading stories in their context, this story follows immediately upon three other parables. So we have to consider whether or not it's related to those things. And then, so you always say, or we might hear, well, in order for you to understand a passage, read the passage before and read the passage after. Okay, well, let's do that. So then the passage before is Luke 15. And what is that talking about? And so when you go back to that, then if you're like I was 15 years ago, 15 years ago, if you're like I was, and you were reading the New Testament as if it was showing you what's true of all people, that all people need salvation, that Jesus has come to deliver us from man-centered works where we try to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, where we try and show our good works to God and say, look what a good person I am, yada, yada, yada. If we have that mindset when we're reading the New Testament, we've already divorced it from the Old Testament, because the Old Testament has nothing to do with a works righteousness salvation, nothing whatsoever. But then again, you assume that it does. 20 years ago, I assumed that it did. So there is consistency there to a certain extent where we think that the Old Testament shows that people tried to be saved by their good works, and then Jesus comes along and he shows us that he does for us what we can't do for ourselves. So you do have some consistency in that paradigm, but then you come across, I think, too many other passages that throw a wrench into that paradigm. So if we're looking at Luke 15 and we see the parable of the lost sheep and the lost coin and the lost son, and we read those together, I think that it makes better sense to understand those things from a starting point rooted in Israel's experience. And I don't remember. I wish that I could go back in time and journal when these paradigm shifts happened, but I remember reading through the book of Deuteronomy. It might have been in the early 2000s, but I remember reading through the book of Deuteronomy, chapters 4 and chapters 28 primarily, and I was just reading them, and I saw within Deuteronomy 4 and Deuteronomy 28, I saw the parable of the lost son. There were numerous connecting points in those two chapters in Deuteronomy and also Luke 15. And that just blew me away.
Wow.
So if that's going to be the case, then that we see the Deuteronomic history of Israel as the groundwork for what happens in the New Testament, and we might get into Deuteronomy 32 at some point, but that becomes the basis for understanding what the New Testament is doing. And so then if Luke 15 is doing that, and Deuteronomy is the basis for Luke 15, then I feel comfortable saying that the basis for Luke 16 and the rich man and Lazarus, because it follows Luke 15, must be taken into account. We have to at least give that some credence. We have to give it its day in court, so to speak, and see if it stands up to that kind of scrutiny. And I think that it does. Then when you do that, a lot of things that we might consider as a story, that is fingers and tongues and water and dogs licking sores and all those kinds of things, all of those things become simply window dressing for the main point. It's almost like the lost son has certain details to it, but we don't make doctrine out of eating pods in a pigsty, or do we?
Right.
If we think back to, I remember seeing a reference to Charles Spurgeon. He's preaching through the prophets, and God says to Israel, "I'm going to wipe you clean like a woman washes a dish," or something like that. So then he goes off into this wacky spiritual thing about dishwashing our lives, and it's just like, really, I don't think that's what it's. But we do that, We do that.
Yes.
We make monumental doctrinal statements about cursory non-issues that are just a part of the story. So the rich man and Lazarus, to finally get around to answering the question, I suppose, the rich man and Lazarus, I would say, is we need to consider it within the story, within Israel's history, and notice those kinds of motifs or those kinds of themes that find their basis, I think, back in Deuteronomy.
Right. So we got that they came right after 3 parables, not 4 or 5. It's 3 parables.
Well, Luke 15 has 3 parables that I think that are obviously thematically unified: the lost coin, the lost sheep, and then the lost son.
Right. So it comes right after 3 parables, and then in the elements of the story, you've got a rich man that's not named, and you have Lazarus that is named. Do you think that there's a reason for that?
Yeah, I think that there are reasons for everything. It's like Samuel's mother isn't named; she's called the woman. So I think that ties her back to Eve to a certain extent. To make those kinds of thematic notations. So what do we know? Well, we know Lazarus. We only know one other Lazarus, and it's not in the Gospel of Luke. He's in the Gospel of John. Lazarus is an English representation of Eleazar. So there's I don't have anything definitive off the top of my head, but I know that it would be worthwhile to look into it. A lot of people I know make a note of the fact that Abraham's servant was Eleazar. I think he was the one who went looking for Isaac's bride. I'm not sure if I'm remembering that correctly. I'm just off the top of my head, but I do know that Abraham had a servant named Eleazar. So,
Right.
is that significant? The rich man not being named. Who is the rich man? He's dressed in purple. I think that's a direct allusion to the Pharisaical aspect. The priestly aspect, and then we can go back to similarities with the older brother in the parable of the lost son, because we know from the parable, we know from Luke 15 that the Pharisees understood that Jesus was talking about them. So there are clues in the storyline itself that I think give us reason to go in that direction.
What do you think? What's the deal with Abraham in Hades? What do you think's going on there? Why is Hades?
Well, Hades and Sheol, I think, are bedfellows. I think that we Hellenize the New Testament too much, so that if we think about the stark contrast.
Before you go on, what does the word Hellenization mean? You may need to pull that out for whoever's listening.
Okay,
yeah,
sure.
Yeah.
Well, the New Testament is written in Greek, and so the Hellenization of the Roman world after Rome, before Rome, you've got Alexander the Great, and he goes in and he Greekifies, he Hellenizes. That's just the term that is used of the Greek influence on culture.
Right, the way they thought, their words, all that, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we have that association to consider as to whether or not the Greek culture influences and informs how we should interpret the New Testament. So if you talk to anybody who's just what I call Granny Smith and Grandpa Joe, just the regular church, mice that read their Bibles and don't do it critically, their concept of hell is going to be what they are told is the New Testament's picture, and then that simply gets assumed and presupposed to be the case. Well, in my opinion, it's difficult to say that something that profound comes out of nowhere in the New Testament that didn't exist in the Old. So my question is, does this concept of hell as a metaphysical place of eternal torment, have we been informed of this place before the book of Matthew? And I don't think that's the case. Right. So the thing that we have in the Old Testament repeatedly is the term Sheol, which is the term commonly referred to for the grave. That is where the dead go. And what most people do is most people throw back their concept of hell and assume that that's what the grave means. So that the grave is more than simply a local physical place that a body gets put into. It's actually also metaphysical. Well, you don't have that kind of explanation in the Old Testament, so you have to then import that idea, and the question is, are you justified in doing that? Is that okay? And I don't think that it is. No. So the idea of Hades and the idea of Sheol, I want to say, are the same. That is, that's the place where the dead go. And so what's interesting,
everyone, right? Do you think like, just a little side note? I'm thinking, what is the book that's like so depressing? You read the book and it's just like, we all die, eat, drink, and be merry. We all go to the grave, So do you think that that's true, like the case as far as afterlife? We all have that same experience.
Well, now I don't think it's the same. I think that before Christ's ascension, the end result for every person was simply death. My understanding is that that there is no metaphysical spirit component to who I am that is immortal and eternal. So when I die, I don't believe that my spirit will escape this body and exist in another realm. I don't believe that that's the case. When I die now, because of Christ and because of my relationship to him, I believe that when I die, I will ascend. My body that I have now will remain, but I will be transformed and ascend to where Christ is, and that will be a different existence. That will be a different experience. I believe it will be corporeal, spiritual, bodily. I don't believe that I will exist simply as a spirit with no body, with no corporality. So that's my understanding of that to a certain extent. But to go back, Hades and Sheol are simply the same reference for where the dead go. Now, when we talk about the fact that when we read Greek literature, we do find that there is an idea of an existence, but I don't think that that's a biblical concept. I think that that's a cultural concept that gets, I guess I would say the Bible gets Hellenized. It gets influenced by that Greek influence.
Did Jesus use stories that were already in circulation and change the characters in the stories to mean different things? Like this story of, Lazarus and the rich man, was that a stock image story that was already existing that he changed?
I've only heard that it is. I haven't come across anything that I personally have seen. So one of the guys that I respect a lot, his name is Glenn Peoples. He has his own podcast called "Say Hello to My Little Friend," and he is he is an annihilationist, and so he helped me think through a lot of this stuff. And he refers to the parable of the rich man and Lazarus as a contemporary story that Jesus hijacks. I don't think that matters too much, because what that does then, in my opinion, is that makes our understanding on the Bible dependent upon some information that we might not ever have.
Right.
So if I might not ever have this information, and that information is key to my understanding the Bible, I struggle with that being a reality then, which goes back to some of the stuff that I've done in my podcast in talking about Genesis. When we look at Genesis chapter 1, I say, in order for us to understand and interpret Genesis chapter 1, we have to have more information before we even start reading Genesis chapter 1. But my argument is we get that information from the Bible. If I have to have ancient Near Eastern information before I read Genesis 1, Granny Smith doesn't have that. Grandpa Joe doesn't have that. My pastor at my church does not ever refer to ancient Near Eastern sources as influencing his understanding of Genesis chapter 1. But if that's what you need and you don't have it, then you're not interpreting the story correctly. So I struggle with, I don't say that we can't be informed and we can't perhaps gain a little bit of insight from those kinds of primary sources from that time period, but I don't lay my foundation on interpreting certain texts on extra biblical texts in that fashion. So I want to say that my information on what Lazarus and the rich man tells me is based in Deuteronomy. So if I know Deuteronomy, I don't have to worry about whether or not Jesus hijacks some allegory or some, common fire pit story that was told in his day and age.
It was N.T. Wright was my first exposure to that word stock, and then it was a story. But I couldn't get the information beyond that. It's like, well, what was the story? Where did he get all this stuff? And so I've struggled to be able to find Yes.
Well, not only that, but then I would also say it doesn't really matter what the story was where Jesus got it, because what Jesus does with it. So, like, let's say for instance, Jesus tells the parable about 3 animals and a little girl, and then he starts to embellish the story and blah blah blah, and we go, well, actually, Jesus got this story from Goldilocks and the 3 bears. I'm like, okay, well, that's fine, but the story that Jesus tells is so different that I don't need to know what Goldilocks is about, because I need to actually just see what Jesus is doing with his story. Because if it's not a cookie cutter story, like if Jesus doesn't tell the story exactly the same, then in my opinion, the primary source doesn't matter, because we need to actually then understand what Jesus is doing with the story itself. So if we think about that, even with what we see in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right? The Synoptic Gospels have similar stories and similar accounts, but we notice that there are details that are different from each gospel. I think that's significant, and I think that shows us that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are constructing the information that they have gotten in a way that fits with how they're writing their gospel. So instead of saying, well, Matthew and Luke tell this account of Jesus and the man of the tombs, and they're so different that shows us that they can't be trusted, because we just don't know which one's real and which one's not. I don't think that that's where we need to go with our conclusion. I think that we simply need to understand that the authors understand that they have liberty to shape the story in a way that follows their writing style and the way that they're communicating the message that they're telling us. So to go back, if Jesus does hijack a story that's out there, he has reshaped it, and it has been influenced, in my opinion, and I would die on this mountain. He has told the story through the influence of Deuteronomy, because there's too many corresponding details that we can find in Deuteronomy that I think shows us that if we understood Deuteronomy, then we would have an easier time with what's going on with the New Testament.
Yeah. All right. In summary, what do you think that the parable is about of Lazarus and the rich man?
Okay, so we would then have to spend time looking at Luke 15 and seeing what those 3 parables are telling us, because I think that they all relate to each other. I think that Luke 15 and 16 should be taken together.
Who is he talking to? Who was he talking to whenever he brought it up? Lazarus and the rich man parable.
Well, I would assume off the top of my head, because I guess I could open my Bible and look at it. But I would just say he's talking to the crowds. He's talking to the audience in the geographical area where he's located. So he's got lay people, he has blue collar workers, and then he also has the white collar bourgeoisie and governmental authorities, known as the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes, and then also the priestly class. So I think that they're all target audience members, because again, the ultimate meta narrative, the overarching story, that's what I mean by the meta narrative. The overarching story is tied all the way back to Israel and her relationship to God under the law of Moses, or under Torah. So if that's going to influence our understanding of those things. So just real quick, you've got the primary thing that I would encourage everyone to consider is, okay, so read Luke 15 and then go back and read Deuteronomy 4 and Deuteronomy 28 and try to see if you can notice any similarities. There is a son who goes to a distant country, and then he comes to himself and he returns to his father. Okay, and his father restores him and welcomes him back. And then you've got an older brother who is standing in judgment and does not come in to the party. Okay, if you know anything about the New Testament, I think you should be making connections right there in terms of what we see. We've got an older brother persecuting a younger brother. That's Cain and Abel. That's Ishmael and Isaac. That's Jacob and Esau. That's Israel and Judah. That is then in the New Testament, we see that in John's first epistle, 1 John, where he talks about brothers loving brothers, and then he makes a reference to Cain and Abel. All of those things are tied together. So he's, it's the culmination of the story in the New Testament. The culmination of what story? I think it's the culmination of the Deuteronomy story, and primarily what we see in Deuteronomy 32. So.
All right. So I'm reading book 15 right now, just skimming through it, and it says he's talking to tax collectors and sinners, and then Pharisees and teachers, and then he opens up with the parables of the lost coin, lost son.
Yeah. Okay. I'll open up my Bible too, just so in case you want to.
Yeah, and then shrewd manager, and then rich man and Lazarus, and so.
Right.
Would the meta-narrative be that, so back in 721, the Assyrians, they come in and they scatter the northern tribes. You got Israel being scattered. And then 586, you've got Babylonian exile, where they come and they destroy the first Solomon temple, and, they take in the slaves and stuff, and they come back. So this story here would be the bringing back of those the lost son, and of those scattered people, and to create a new covenant, right? That would be the meta narrative of all of these. He's talking to the Pharisees, and that would be the older brother, the Pharisees, and then he's talking to the with ears to hear, would be the believers, the younger brother. So what do you think about that? Do you have anything to add to that? So as far as the rich man and Lazarus, taking kingdom away from rich man, which would be the the Pharisees and such, and then giving it Lazarus gets to have the kingdom of Lazarus. If we tie it back to Eleazar, we've got Gentiles, we tie all that together. That's the scatter being brought back together, and the kingdom being given to them. So that could be what this is about. Do you agree with that? As far as
I think that those are things that we need to consider. Yeah, I think that those are a healthier way of looking at it, rather than just making it a generic story for somebody living in Baltimore, Maryland. This story is about me.
Mm.
How am I like the rich man? How am I like Lazarus? Or I don't think that that's a helpful way to approach the Bible. I think that the items that you just delineated, I think, are key for us to consider before we even go down a personal application road.
Yeah. Okay. Do you have anything else you want to add to Richmond and Lazarus? Do you want to move on to the next one?
Yeah, I think we probably, I think we've done enough for that.
Okay. This is one that I'm working on right now. I was working on last night. It's the wheat and tares, and got a little video and everything put together for it. I'd like to have something with you vocally describing your understanding of the wheat and tares story.
Are we in Matthew 13?
Parable and goats. Yeah, if you want to tie them both together, wheat and tares and sheep and goats, we can do that.
And we're in Matthew 13.
Yes, yeah, and then just who are the wheat, who are the tares, what happened to them? What is that story talking about?
Okay. Well, again, the meta-narrative is key, okay? It is the meta-narrative. This is about Israel. That's where Jesus is. That's who Jesus is speaking to. And so Jesus is not coming to Israel in his day. He's not coming to the people in his day with something new that's never been done before. Jesus is not, I mean, he does to a certain extent when in Matthew 5 when he says, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." There is a way in which Jesus recouches, or, he reconstructs and tries to reshape their thinking, but his basis for the reshaping is not new. He is trying to bring it back, I think, to the original intent of what the story was about. So we have to understand the meta-narrative. So if we're looking at Matthew 13, again, he's talking to the crowds, and the whole crowd stood on the beach. He told them many things in parables. Okay, so I would say, instead of saying parable, I would say he told them many things in allegory. So he's telling them one story, but he's telling them different stories to bring out, to embellish and to give a fullness to what he's trying to teach them. So, yeah, parables, which is, the disciples. So here's something interesting. Let me ask you a question, David.
Okay.
What would you say if someone said to you, why did Jesus talk to them in parables? What have you heard? What is something that you can recall? I know one thing in particular, but I don't want to put words into your mouth. So is there something in particular, like if you heard a sermon on Jesus speaking in parables, what do you think a pastor would say as to why Jesus did that?
The one idea I have right now is that they have a foundational background of memorizing Torah and memorizing it, so their culture is thick. So when he's telling these stories, the people that are a part of that culture are going to understand what he's talking about. They're expecting Messiah to come and to end this kingdom, this kingdom of darkness, the old covenant kingdom, and to be ushered into the new covenant kingdom, And so that they're expecting the story. So when Jesus is telling these parables, those with ears to hear will know what he's talking about, or supposedly. I mean, even the disciples struggled to know what he was talking about. But they had that educational foundation. So that's part of my theory on why he used such thick parables. So what do you think? What's your opinion?
Well, I think that's a more mature response than most would give, and I don't disagree with it with what you said. So in my experience, and I think in most Granny Smith and Grandpa Joe's experience, is that they would have been told by their pastor, kind of like what we already talked about with the rich man and Lazarus. That is that Jesus told parables because he wanted to relate to the people in a way that they could understand. So he told stories. So, Jesus was the master storyteller. And what that becomes then is usually that Jesus told parables to help people understand what he was trying to say. Okay? But Jesus doesn't say that when he's asked why. The disciples say to Jesus, "Why are you telling them parables?" And Jesus basically says, "I'm telling them parables to hide the truth." Okay, he says, "To you it has been given to know the secrets, but to them it has not been given." That's why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. So he, on the one hand, you said it, if you have eyes to hear, eyes to see and ears to hear, you're going to understand the parable. But it was also given to further condemn those who didn't hear and who didn't listen. So it's not that they didn't understand, it's that they didn't listen.
Okay.
They didn't see what he was telling them. And that thing of seeing is not the idea of getting it. It's not like, well, you don't get it, so now you're going to be punished. No, that's not the idea. Seeing is comprehension, is acknowledgement, and listening is acknowledgement. So when you don't see and you don't hear, it's because you've made a willful action not to do that. So think about the very first account of martyrdom in the book of Acts with Stephen. Stephen just lays it on the line. And what do? They stop their ears and they gnash their teeth and they rush upon him and kill him. That's what it means not to see. That's what it means not to hear. And so the parables are not given to make it easily understood, because as you pointed out too, the disciples didn't get everything. So if he did do that, he wasn't very good at it because they didn't get it very easy, right? So even there, we don't have consistency. So the parables are parables of judgment. That is that they are told, Jesus is saying, I'm doing this so that those who are condemned have no plausible deniability. Jesus is like, I told you these things and you didn't listen. So then we have the parable of the sower, and we have the parable of the weeds. That, again, is, I think, something for us to consider. The contrast, again, is, I think, so when we look at the wheat and the tares and the sheep and the goats, I would say that I want us to see that as analogous to the older brother and the younger brother motif, because that's the contrast of that relationship, the good seed, the bad seed, that kind of thing. And so you've got, let's see, in Matthew 13:29, do you want us to gather all of these up together? No, lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. So let both grow together until the harvest. And the harvest time, I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and bind them, and then the bundles will be burned. So, okay, so we're talking about hell to a certain extent. And so right here in this parable, we have a gathering of weeds and tares, and we have those that are gathered into a barn for safekeeping, and those that are burned. Okay? So this isn't an eternal fire. We don't imagine that this burning of the wheat lasts forever. So at least in this detail of this parable, we don't have that. In our mind, when you burn the chaff, and 10 seconds, it's gone. It's burned up. So that's just an interesting thing to keep in the back of our minds in terms of, so what's happening? What does burned represent here? I would say it represents covenant judgment. What is being brought into the barn represent? I would say that it's covenant preservation or vindication. So then going on to the next one with the mustard seed and the leaven, I don't think there's anything in there necessarily to talk about hell. There are things that are important. So one thing that I want to say in this one, at least, the kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed, the smallest of seeds. When it grows larger than all of the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. If you start to read through the book of Jeremiah, at least in the early chapters, you will notice that in that prophetic word that Jeremiah brings, people are plants. Mm-hmm. People are vegetation. Okay? And then when you get into Ezekiel, we see, I think, in the end of 38, I think, off the top of my head, somewhere around there, we've got the birds of the air coming down and feasting on dead bodies. I would say that those birds are people as well. So then here, what is the parable of the mustard seed and the leaven? What is this that's, what's going on here? What are the birds? Is it real? Is it literal birds? We're talking about the kingdom of heaven. So just details that we need to think about. So then we get to the parable of the weeds explained. So one of the key things in there is verse 40, just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so it will be at the end of the age, right? The end of the eon or the ion, and that's the same root that we get eternity from. But I don't think eternity is a very helpful term for us. I think that has too much Hellenization to it. I think it has too much Greek influence. I think that it should be rather more Hebraic. I think that it should be more Deuteronomic and more associated with Genesis 1 as well. But we have this term at the end of the age. And we have to consider, we're going to see that term later on. And I'm trying to think if we saw it in chapter 10. I'm just looking for it real quick. So we have, in chapter 10, we have similar information that we do see in chapter 23 of Matthew. Jesus says, beware of men, for they will deliver you over to courts and flog you in their synagogues. You will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake to bear witness. Okay, that's what Jesus says that Jesus is going to do for the Pharisees and the scribes. He says, I am going to send you my witnesses. And Jesus says here that he's saying to his disciples, I'm going to send you to be witnesses. He says, when they deliver you over, do not be anxious. It's not you who's speaking, but the Spirit. Brother will deliver brother. Okay, that is a key theme that starts all the way back at Genesis 4. You will be hated for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the telos will be saved, the one who endures to the end. Well, that's the same language we see in Matthew 24. And my question is, so when we're reading Matthew 20 or Matthew 10 right now, when we see the one who endures to the end, what is Jesus talking about? The end of what? Well, Granny Smith and Grandpa Joe are going to tell you the end of the world because that's what they've been preconditioned and indoctrinated to believe. This is talking about the end of the world. But the problem with that is that Jesus says, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes, right? So I mean, there's so many things that if we paid attention, the Bible itself would scream at us, you're not reading me correctly. So going back to Matthew chapter 10, I was looking for the end of the age and I didn't see it. I got distracted by something else. But it's still similar. You know, the theme is still there. The one who endures to the end. So right now, just looking through Matthew 10, I don't see anything about the end. So then when we get to Matthew 13 and we see the end of the age, I'm going to presuppose that the audience knows what Jesus means by that. He doesn't explain it. There's not a footnote. Nobody says, Jesus, I'm sorry, what? The end of what age? What are you talking about? So Matthew already assumes that whoever's reading his text knows what Jesus is talking about. Mm-hmm. So that's a key phrase for us to consider, the end of the age. So then you've got burned with fire at the end of the age. And then, you know, what does that mean? What is that relating to? So all of those, I'm trying to maybe just throw out enough to have people have interesting triggers in their mind, I suppose, encouraging them to read into this stuff. But, you know, so you've got, in that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And so what's interesting about that then is that if you have weeping and gnashing of teeth in that place where there is a fiery furnace burning with fire, then if we think about, well, is that literal? If it is, then there's a place that's literally burning with fire, and in order to have teeth that are gnashing, they can't be extinguished. They have to continue on and on and on, otherwise there's no way for them to gnash and grind. So there's all of these interesting, you know, presuppositions that we would say, well, in my opinion, I would say no. This is a description of what being shut out of the kingdom looks like. So when the audience that was listening to Stephen heard him accuse them of wickedness, they gnashed their teeth because he was preaching to them, and in his preaching he was shutting them out. He had the keys of the kingdom, and he was shutting them out. You are stiff-necked people. You always do what your fathers did, that kind of stuff. So, in my opinion, the weeping and gnashing of teeth is the older brother standing on the outside looking in with contempt and hatred for his younger brother. So it's not a description of what happens to a sinner for eternity because he's a sinner and he's a bad sinner, wicked, bad person. That's not what's going on. It's talking about being a participant in the culmination of the story, which is the kingdom of God, which is what Jesus and John the Baptist come preaching, which is what Paul preaches all throughout the book of Acts. At the beginning of his ministry, when he's converted, he preaches the kingdom. At the end of the book of Acts, he's preaching the kingdom. And we see examples in that story from Acts 9 to Acts 28. We have examples of people gnashing their teeth and grinding their teeth and being angry at the messenger. So it's helpful. It's helpful for me to think about it that way. The meta narrative is really, I think, the most informative way to read this, and it makes the most sense of it. So then, in each of the parables, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 more parables in Matthew 13 that Jesus says, all of those parables are highlighting aspects of the same meta narrative.
What meta narrative? Like, what was the blazing furnace?
What was a blazing furnace? Well, I suppose if I wanted to just to be simple about it, I would say it's the place where the weeds are burned. It's an oven where the harvesters throw the chaff and the worthless vegetation that is not going to be harvested for productivity. So if it's consistent, let us grow them together until the harvest, and at the harvest time we will gather the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned. Okay, where are they burned? I would just go back down to verse 42. They're burned in the fiery furnace. And what is it that's burned in the fiery furnace in verse 42? It's not weeds. It's all causes of sin and lawbreakers. They will gather out of his kingdom. See, all of that language is so similar. What are they gathering? Gathering out, gathering in, gathering out. No, lest in gathering the weeds, you gather the wheat along with them. And then you have gathering again at the end of the age. You can't separate these two things. So the gathering of weeds and wheat should be held in parallel to verses 41 and following. The Son of Man will send his angels. They will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and lawbreakers. That's the weeds. And throw them into the fiery furnace, which is the same place where the weeds were bundled up and burned. And the righteous will shine forth like suns, and, that's the wheat. So I wouldn't make too much of, what the fiery furnace, what is the fiery furnace? It's just a part of the story. Don't get lost in that detail. You might as well just say, what kind of weeds were they? Were they dandelions? I hate dandelions.
I hate dandelions. But do you think, though, that he's talking about Jerusalem in AD 70? I mean, as far as most definitely. And we can't get there yet because Matthew, the story is before AD 70. But Deuteronomy 32 is key in understanding the context for the meta-narrative, the overarching story that we are reading in the New Testament. So if we were to look back at Deuteronomy 32, there is, I think, maybe we should turn back there real quick. I don't have it memorized, so I'm going to have to look through it, I suppose, to see if I can.
Well, I've got one thing highlighted here. Okay, so verse 20. I'll say verse 19. Then Yahweh saw it and spurned them because of the provocations of his sons and daughters. And he said, I will hide my face from them, and I will see what their end will be, for they are a perverse generation, children in whom there is no faithfulness. So we need to memorize those two verses, because Jesus calls the generation that he is ministering to a perverse generation. Mm-hmm. Okay? That should not be separated from this. Why does Jesus... So if a pastor was preaching through the text where Jesus says, this wicked generation, this perverse generation, whatever, why does he call them that? Because Jesus is associating that generation with Deuteronomy 32. And in that association with a perverse generation is verse 20, where Yahweh says, I will see what their end will be. Well, we've already talked about the end. The one who endures to the end. So in Deuteronomy 32, there's a nuance of the story where God says, okay, we're going to see this story come to fruition. We're going to see it come to an end. We're going to see it run its course. And I think that is something that needs to influence and inform the language that we see in Matthew, primarily with the end. What end is Jesus talking about? I think he's talking about the end that Deuteronomy 32 is delineating, which ultimately is judgment on God's sons and daughters that provoke him to anger by their idolatry and unfaithfulness to his covenant. Mm. But I mean, everything that we're talking about is huge. I mean, there's just no way for us to unpack everything. It's just huge. What's interesting? Think about this, right? So, verse 23 and 24. This just came to my mind. I could be wrong, but it just came to my mind, so I'm going to say it. Yahweh says, I will heap disasters upon them. I will spend my arrows on them. They will be wasted with hunger, devoured by plague, pestilence, right? So there are going to be wars and rumors of wars and famines. Mm-hmm. I will send the teeth of beasts against them. All right, so what's the language of beasts in the Old Testament? It's not just about physical bears and lions and tigers. It's nations. And the venom of things that crawl in the dust. Okay, and what's interesting is, at the end of Mark says that Jesus' disciples will be preserved against poison and venomous creatures.
So that's what that meant. Oh, okay. Wow.
You know what I mean?
Because
otherwise,
the references.
Otherwise, you've got crazy snake handlers in Alabama.
Right.
I mean, seriously.
So, yeah. So just for the listeners, like you've got John the Baptist calling them a brood of vipers, and you got just pay attention to who's calling who vipers and snakes and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, there's even a venomous reference.
Yeah. I was just looking down. Here's okay. So Jesus could very well have said this. It's so it's interesting. Like there's so many times when I've read through the Psalms. And I think, oh man, that totally could fit Jesus, but it's never quoted in the New Testament. But we do see Psalms quoted in the New Testament that we say, oh, this Psalm is a messianic Psalm. Well, I've read plenty of other Psalms that I've never heard called messianic that I totally see in the ministry of Jesus. So when Jesus is giving the parables in Matthew 13, and they say, why do you speak to them in parables? And in Matthew 23, when he says, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I would have gathered you like a hen gathers her chicks, right? Jesus is basically saying, that you would have listened. that you would have discerned what my message was to you so that you could be saved. So look what happens in I just lost it. Here it is. Deuteronomy 32, 28, and 29. They are a nation void of counsel, and there is no understanding in them. If they were wise, that's totally Jesus' ministry, preaching to the wise, right?
Right.
If they were wise, they would understand this. They would discern their latter end.
Their latter end, yeah, in the first century.
You know,
yeah.
that it's all about the culmination of the story. So what ends up happening is that the Pharisees. This is my metaphor.
All right, like I said, thanks for tuning in. And, make sure you check us out. Facebook, Rethinking Revelation. Twitter, Rethinking Revelation. Revelation.com as well, where I have a SpeakPipe app that lets you post an audio question. Please make sure you visit that website because we also have John Sedlak's blog available for you to benefit from, his in-depth studies that he does through the New Testament. And I guess that's about it. Until next time.